it. That's it. That's the end of it. All right. Looks like the clock says it's time to go. Welcome each one to our Sunday morning Bible class. This morning we'll be on Genesis chapter 50. We're finishing up Genesis today. Before we begin our class, let's go to God in prayer. God, we're thankful to you for affording us this time to assemble here so that we may study your word. We ask you to help us to approach this study with open minds, receptive hearts, so that all of the good stuff would sink deep into our hearts, and we can, through your help, produce a lot of fruit for you. May your name be glorified in all that we do. In Christ's name, amen. All right, we are on Genesis chapter 50. And if you have not noticed, Genesis chapter 50 is the end of Genesis. We were a long time getting here, but it has absolutely been a fun journey to get here to this point. In verse 1, we begin, then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now when the days of mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I am dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. Then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians. Therefore its name was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. So his sons did for him just as he commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as a property for a burial place. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went up with him to bury his father. So we saw in the last chapter where Israel had drew his last breath in the final verses of chapter 49. We knew that was a time coming, didn't we? And that's the time that we all will face at some point. It's the time that we will draw our last breath. And I think we can say that Israel, despite all of the bad things that happened, it ended up good, didn't it? His son that he thought was dead for a long time was restored to him. And he got to spend the last 17 years of his life with that beloved son. I would take that as a win anytime. So we see now that there is the great lamentation being raised for Israel. And, we see in verse 1 just how close the relationship was between Joseph and Jacob, don't we? It says in verse 1, then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Now, the next thing is something that not everybody got to have. Then Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed his father. So there were actual doctors that were there to prepare Israel's body for mummification, to preserve it. This was a very long process. This was nothing like the embalming of today. Today it's just a short time, and this, they fill you full of whatever they fill you full of, and that's it. It's done. But this was about a 40-day requirement to get this job done. So in amongst all of the physical things that they did, typically the embalming process also had to do with some religious functions as well. Typically, there were priestly incantations, magical spells. They called on either Anubis or Osiris, the gods of the dead. Those were prominent in Egypt at the time. We do know, however, that Joseph only worshiped God Jehovah. So that didn't have anything to do with them. Now this process, I'm going to kind of refer to this commentary here as to what they actually did with this. It's a pretty neat thing. So usually only the wealthy, high esteemed people could afford this embalming, this mummification. And not everybody got that because of the process that it was. So what they did, and of course Joseph's main concern here was to preserve his father's body from decay, so that they could get through this 70 days of mourning, and he could get him back to Machpelah bury him. So this was not going to, this was certainly not going to be like a typical funeral that we have today. I mean, today is like, you know, at least in our culture, you die today, and then within a couple of 3 days, you're buried, and all of this is put together and it's done and it's over with. But that was not the way that was back then. So what they did, the physicians made incisions to remove the major organs of the body. They would preserve the bodies by using a drying process with a mineral salt such as natron or some other similar desiccant, which is a chemical drying agent. Other oils and resins were applied, and the empty body cavities were filled with spices or other substances to retain its basic form. Finally, the body was wrapped with numerous linen cloths that had been soaked in resins to protect it from further damage. These references where we see the reference to the embalming of Joseph and Jacob are the only examples that we see in the Old Testament or in Genesis about this. But this was a thing that the Egyptians did, and it was a very time-consuming process, and it was a costly process. So, you know, Joe Blow Egyptian didn't necessarily get this. He got buried, and that was it. Tony? Yes. They did. It was a, yeah. And you know, the other part of that too, I think that's a really good point. He wanted this done correctly too. So, you know, right. Exactly that point. That was because that was a big deal to the Egyptians, was for it to be a religious ceremony as well. That was the whole point of all of that, is to preserve, and this is typically for the pharaohs. They would preserve them for the afterlife, you know, and of course they would even, I've read of examples where they would, you know, the pharaoh dies, they embalm the pharaoh, put him in the burial chamber in there. Some of his servants may have been buried with him. They had provisions for them to go into the next life. I reckon so he'd have something to eat along the way. I don't know. But it all had to do with religious beliefs, with a lot of what they did. So Joseph's main concern was he needed to get through. He had already promised Jacob that he would bury him in his homeland, where he came from, and that was going to be a kind of an undertaking. And thankfully, God had provided with Joseph, so that he now had the means to take care of that. Had Joseph not been the second in command of Egypt, do you think that he would have been able to do all of this stuff? No, he wouldn't. He wouldn't have been able to do that at all. So, It didn't say, and I don't know if from what I got from reading this, I don't know that they even did preserve those, unless they wrapped them separately in some of those same resins that they wrapped them in. Mm-hmm. It would have probably, my guess is, it would have probably been some of the same resins, spices, all of the things that they used to put in the body cavity to put in there to preserve that as well. So, um, what does the Bible say happens to us when we die? To our body. Exactly. We return to the ground from which we were created. And there's a number of ways of dealing with the body that way. There's we have the standard burials, and then of course we have also cremation seems to have become a more popular thing. Some people have certain ideas one way or the other about both of those, and that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that when we leave this earth, our spirit will go back to the staying place. I'm trying to pull the right word out of there, but that's not happening this morning. So we either go to the place where we're all going to hang out until judgment, either paradise or torment, one of those two, and our body will go back to dust or ashes. So, I used to, years ago, I used to have these thoughts of, well, how would this affect me in the resurrection if I was cremated? And then one day, all of a sudden, this thought came to me is like, wait a minute, dummy. If you don't think that the God that you serve can put all them ashes back together if he needs to, wants to, you might need to rethink things a little bit. So I guess that's kind of my thought on that matter. It does. I mean, it's the end result's going to be the same. It is. So, but, and that's a whole discussion for another class. But it's just kind of interesting to think of those. No, it ain't. It's not. It's not. And there's nothing we have here is going with us. Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, all right then. Wonder where he got that, but that's okay. Okay, that's all right. I don't care one way or the other. It don't matter to me. I think the yeah, yeah. It's a it's a I think it's a matter of personal preference, quite honestly. Because what matters is our soul. And that's right. And see, here's the other thing. When we get to heaven, we're getting a new body. We're not even going to need this one anymore. We're not even going to want this one anymore. We're getting a new one. Exactly, and that's the point we sometimes miss. Is no, who does? Who wants that? We want the new body that we're promised, and yeah, that's so many things, but yeah, yeah. You know what's going to be really exciting is that we'll be able to see and to talk to people that lived way before. Can you imagine sitting down and talking to Paul? How about that? How good is that going to be? Yeah. Anyway, so they got the embalming done. They did the 70 days of mourning for Jacob, as what the Egyptians do, and now it's time to take Jacob back to Machpelah and bury him. Now, Joseph does some diplomatic things here. You know, Joseph has got he's got Pharaoh on speed dial, right? We know that. He's the second in command. But that's not how he approaches Pharaoh. It's very likely that because this was a time of mourning, Joseph is very likely not shaved, not cleaned up. He's in his mourning clothes, in his funeral garments, and he can't go to Pharaoh looking like that. So that's when he sends some of Pharaoh's household to say, "Hey, this is my request. I want to ask," and then he made this request in verse 5, or beginning of verse 4. If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. So Joseph actually sends word to Pharaoh, asking permission to leave, to go to bury his father. Now, one thing here that is kind of, when you read in verse 5 here, you almost would think that Jacob dug the grave. But we read everywhere else that Abraham bought that cave to bury in. So what do we make out of that? What do you think? The cave was there. The cave always was there. What is very likely is that perhaps, Isaac, Jacob had each one dug out some other passages in there, some chambers, if you will, for burying. And I think that's what that actually means. Is that there were some other burial chambers in there that they had dug out themselves to put them in there. So, because you remember, Jacob buried who in there? Leah. So Pharaoh granted permission, and so they went up to bury his father, and what a great procession went. They got an armed escort there, and then they went up to this threshing floor and had a great time of mourning there. It was a very solemn lamentation, so much so that the Canaanites all took notice of them. Like, wow, this was a big deal. This was, and you know, they would have probably thought this was a very well-known, high-up man to be mourned in this way. All right, so they got through with all of that. They got him buried. They got the mourning done, and then they returned. They returned to Egypt. And then, beginning in verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, Thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers for their sin, for they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face. And they said, "Behold, we are your servants." Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, in order to bring it about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. All right, so the next section deals with the fact that Joseph's brothers are still worrying. They are still, I think their conscience is still bothering them. Joseph has already forgiven them, right? Don't we see where Joseph has already forgiven his people or his brothers? Now they worried about it because they figured they thought maybe he might renege and take it out on them now, take retribution out on them. But there's a couple of things that we see here. We see how Joseph felt about that when it was told to him that his brothers felt that way. The first thing was that his brothers wouldn't even go to him in person and talk to him about it. They've got to send somebody else. Can you imagine how that made Joseph feel? Uh-huh. Yeah. I think the other thing we see here too is that while Joseph has forgiven his brothers have not forgiven themselves. How many times in our lives today do we have that same problem? We have done something either to somebody or against God. And we've asked for forgiveness. And that forgiveness was granted. But yet what we do is we keep beating ourselves up. We keep hashing it back up again and again and again and worrying over it. And we forget that when God forgives, He wipes it away. But for some reason, we as humans don't want to do it that way. We think that we need to keep rehashing the same sin over and over and over again. And we need to keep reliving that over and over and over again. And when I read this passage of Scripture here, and I see how Joseph felt, and it makes me think, how does Jesus feel when we question our forgiveness? I said it makes me think, how does Jesus feel when we question our forgiveness? When we do what Joseph's brothers did. Well, Dad's gone. He's going to probably take it out on us now. It's like we feel like they were saying, well, Joseph wasn't sincere in his forgiveness. He's just waiting for a time to strike us. That's what they were saying with that. And when we do the same thing, isn't that us saying, well, maybe Jesus really wasn't sincere when he forgave us? Maybe he didn't really mean it when he forgave us. Isn't that what we're in effect saying? It's a good point, Lou. The devil wants us to think, God really didn't forgive y'all for that. He told you he did, but nah, he really didn't. He's got it wrote down somewhere, and when you least expect it, he's going to bring that back up. That's just like what the devil told Eve in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. What had God told them? Don't take and eat of the tree that's in the midst of the garden of the knowledge of good and evil. Because in the day you do, you shall surely die. Right? Remember that? What did the devil tell Eve? You shall not surely die. He put one little 3-letter word in there, and that changed the entire meaning of everything, didn't it? So that's the things the devil does to try to get us off our center, off a kilter, if you will. And it's good that this passage is here, because there is so much that we can get out of that. And Joseph finally told him, he says, look, what you did, you meant it to evil. You meant harm to me. We all know that. But you need to understand, God meant this for good. God meant to get me here and use me to preserve life. And that's what Joseph's job was to work, and that God through him would preserve the life so that they could become this great nation that God had already promised was going to happen. And in a couple of weeks, when we start in Exodus, and I'm pretty excited about Exodus too. Chris is going to do an awesome job with that. We're going to see that they did in fact become this great nation. That God's promise was fulfilled. That God does follow through on everything he says. And then he reassures them. And he says to them, don't be afraid. Don't think that I'm going to deal out some level of retribution to y'all because of what you did. That's over. It's done. It's behind us. Joseph is showing them here how much he loves his brothers. They didn't feel the same way about him to start with, but he did. And this whole story about Joseph going into Egypt is such an antitype that foreshadows Jesus, doesn't it? How many similarities do you see between the life of Joseph and the things that he endured, the things he did, and the things that Jesus did? How many things do you see there? And many times we read of these antitypes here in order to get us in the mind of thinking about what Jesus actually did. Now, an antitype is not meant to say that Joseph was the same as Jesus, that he was sinless and that he gave his life for all of humanity. No, that's not what that says at all. But when we read the story of Joseph, and then we go and then we read the story of Jesus, we say, well, God was already thinking about this, wasn't he? God already had that plan. And in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, we saw where God first told us about that plan, didn't we? And then the scripture says that he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Whatever it took for Joseph to restore the relationship with his brothers. You know, the worst thing in the world that you can endure is to have a bad relationship with your siblings. And Joseph wanted so much to have that good relationship with him. And then in verse 22 through the end of the chapter, so Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the 3rd generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And just like that, Genesis is over. It's done. It took us a long time to get there, didn't it? But what a ride it was. We're going to see in Exodus, when they leave Egypt, they're going to take Joseph with them. Joseph will be taken. Hadn't read that far ahead yet, but I imagine they'll be taken to his to where his family's inheritance is going to be. Isn't it wonderful that Joseph was able to spend some years with his beloved father? And wasn't it wonderful that he was able to see his son's children, some of which were raised up on his knees? And Joseph knew that there was going to come a time when they would be taken out of there, when they would be taken away from the land of Egypt, and they will return to the land of Canaan to be given their inheritance. You see, up to that time, they were just sojourners in a foreign land. There was nowhere near enough of them to mount up any kind of resistance to just take what they wanted. Now, we know that through God, all things are possible. But God has a way He wants to do things. And in order for Him to have these different tribes in these different places and all of this vast land, He's going to have enough of them there to establish. And in order to do that, God decided that He would raise up this great nation in a good land, in the land of Goshen. We read that it was a good land. It was good for raising livestock. It was rather sparsely populated. So God picked out the right spot for them in the interim. Now, next week, what my plan is to have one final follow-up lesson to kind of tie all of the book of Genesis together. And then the following week, I reckon we'll pick up in Exodus. So we're looking forward to that. I don't know if there's any kind of book or anything that Chris is going to have with that, but it's going to be a good study. And what I hope is that we have spent enough time in Genesis laying the groundwork here so that when we get into Exodus and they leave, and then we start reading about their travels and their journey on the way to their promised land, that some of the things will make more sense as we read. So, has anybody got? We got a couple minutes. Anybody got anything you want to throw in for the good of the order? Mm-hmm. Well, the Canaanites had always been idolatrous. I don't know that they, and of course they had a lot of different practices that they would do, but what they did not do is they did not practice according to God. So, it wasn't necessarily that every single person in all of Canaan were like Sodom and Gomorrah necessarily. But God also knew that if He didn't cleanse the land of that evil, that it would pretty quick overtake His people. So if that kind of answers your question, and it'll make it'll make a lot more sense as we study into Exodus as well. So, well, thank y'all for being here today, and we'll finish up with our